I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. They say everything is bigger in Texas. Well, that's not true when it comes to the ego of Wendell Barnhouse. He likes to describe himself as a craftsman, not an artist. Whatever the writing style, there's no doubt about this. Wendell's peers had a ton of respect for him when the Texan was covering college football and basketball for many moons. I know I did. If it was a big game, you could find Wendell. 26 Final Fours, 343 NCAA tournament games, 14 college football national championship games. Wendell was always there, and he was forever on top of things, locally and nationally. That means Wendell has some stories, and you're going to enjoy hearing them. Wendell, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Great to be here, Todd. Good to connect again. You know that as the years go by and retirements hit and we fail to meet in press boxes, you lose track of people, and that was one of the highlights of the job, as you well know, was reconnecting with guys every weekend at a game or whatever. So good to see you.
It's one thing I must point out, though, Wendell, you're a little bit older than me, just a little bit. Now, sources tell me that back in the day when you first started, you actually used a typewriter.
Well, that's because that's what was there. Yeah. And actually, like right when I started out of high school, my first newspaper stories I would write out by hand.
Wow.
And then type them up and take them to the paper. And you know, that was really old school. But yeah, until I had been in the business for, I guess about 5 years when I got a job in Tucson, Arizona at the Arizona Daily Star. They had computers, and that was the first time I worked on a computer. Before that, everything I did typed up all my stories on a typewriter.
So they did not have computers at the Bedrock Gazette.
No. And my car was powered by my feet.
Fred, Barney, and Wendell were all left to their own devices.
That's right. Yeah, Barney was a great source.
Well, you did discover computer technology, and you certainly later found a calling in covering national college basketball and football, and did so as well as anyone for 25 years at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. That's how we got to know each other. I want to go back to those typewriter days just for a moment. So it's 1974. You're in Hannibal, Missouri, hometown of Mark Twain, by the way.
No pressure there.
No pressure. At the Hannibal Courier-Post, you're the sports editor, a one-man staff, right?
Yep. When the job at Hannibal came open, the other candidate was a college graduate who had tragically lost an arm in a car accident. So they hired me over a one-arm sports writer.
Wow.
And I was 19 when I was first hired. But yeah, it was a little afternoon paper, Hannibal, Missouri. And I was sports editor. They gave me a 3-month probation, and then they hired me. I guess
3 months. That's it. I had like 30 years of probation.
Well, I guess they gave it to me a little quicker than 3 months. But yeah, I mean, I was 19. I hadn't been to college, and so I don't blame them for waiting. But right around my 20th birthday, I got the job, and so it was interesting. But Hannibal wasn't. At the age of 19, there wasn't anything going on in Hannibal. And I don't think we even had a fast food restaurant, which at that time was my breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it was kind of hard to eat.
So there's nothing going on, but this kid who wanted to play shortstop for the St. Louis Cardinals would sometimes drive 2 hours to St. Louis. Now, the very first time that you went to cover a Cardinals game, you go into the locker room. What happened?
I stood there frozen and scared to death. I mean, I grew up a Cardinals fan. I was Columbia, Missouri was 2 hours away. Hannibal was 2 hours away. And, it was really amazing that, I thought I asked for a press pass. I said, oh, yeah, sure. So I oh, wow, I can actually be a sport.
Yeah, you got two arms. Come on in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's we don't let one-armed writers in. Anyway, so, but I go in there, there's, Lou Brock, and Gibson was still on the team. And these are the guys, like when I was really the first time I got into baseball was 1964, where they won the World Series over the Yankees. These are the guys I grew up worshiping and idolizing, and I'm here in the same locker room with them. And I think the first time I didn't talk to anybody, I was scared to death. And then finally I kind of got my courage up and started talking to them and tried to interview them. So yeah, that was, it was a weird thing because, I mean, it wasn't like I was a 23 or 24-year-old. I mean, I was like just out of high school, and here I was in the Cardinals locker room. So that was, it was a strange.
It was like being in a classroom, right? I mean, you're learning from the other reporters.
I don't know if I was that. I was just like, can I ask Lou Brock a question? Oh, my God. I mean, it's like, and I was actually there one time, I guess it was, must have been 73. It was I went to a Cardinals-Mets game, and it went in the Mets locker room because the Mets won. Willie Mays was there. I was standing like right next to Willie Mays, next to Felix Beyond.
Right.
But here I was like, I mean, I wasn't, he wasn't a Cardinal, but it was Willie Mays, for God's sake. And I was standing there. I didn't ask him anything, but it was just like, I don't know if any of the players noticed or paid any attention, but they must have, what the hell is this guy doing in here? I mean, come on.
Well, you had two arms, but you were mute.
Exactly. Yeah, I was scared. I was totally intimidated.
Well, I gotta say that I grew up in the Cincinnati area when I started in the business in the late 80s, going into Riverfront Stadium, and the manager's Pete Rose, and I used to have a Pete Rose poster on my wall as a child. And I'm asking Pete for the daily double. I mean, actually asking him for the pitch and rotation. It was a little strange, and you had to get used to that. But you did. I mean, you learned how to do your craft. You learned how to interview. You learned how to develop sources. You went on to cover 26 Final Fours, 14 college national title games in football. But prior to that time of covering college football as a writer, you actually spent a few years on the desk.
You're right.
As an assistant sports editor at some places. You were in Arizona, Atlanta, the Dallas Morning News, designing pages, editing stories. What did that experience do for you as a writer when you turned to writing full-time?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not trying to be humble here, Todd, but I mean, as a writer, I always thought of myself just as a craftsman, not an artist. But I think being on the desk, first of all, it really showed me more of the inner workings, particularly when in Arizona was the first time I'd worked at a morning paper. So I was in there at night. The deadlines, I mean, there's deadlines at afternoon papers, but deadlines for morning papers a little bit different. There's a little bit more pressure. So I learned a lot about putting pages out and screaming at writers for missing deadline and putting me under even more pressure. A lot of what I learned was understanding when I got out to be a writer was understanding what the desk was going through with, you weren't the only writer filing on deadline. There are other writers coming in with stories, and, it's a little bit like an air traffic controller where you're saying, this game went extra innings. Okay, well, what do we got to do now? Or, like when Villanova beats Georgetown in the national championship game, you got to maybe rip up the front page for what you thought you were going to do and say, this is one of the biggest stories in college basketball history. How are you going to display that?
Right.
And so that was a lot of what I learned as far as, just kind of the inner workings of I knew about headlines and pictures and layouts and all that kind of stuff. But I think when you're in there, particularly at night, when you're the guy that's kind of in charge of the section, you kind of understand how this all works. So when I got out as a writer, we always used to have the handcuff there where there'd be a lot of editors that hadn't been out writing, it was like, well, why couldn't you have interviewed that guy before he shot his free throws to win the game? I mean, it was almost like that. It was just like, okay, we're going to handcuff you and take you into a locker room and let you stand around for 10 minutes. It's like you've been there, you're on deadline and they take 15 minutes to open the locker room.
Right.
And you're sweating to get quotes.
Right.
And, and the editor says, well, how come you were like, it's like, did you want quotes in the story or not?
So it gave you a perspective. You understood the process.
Exactly.
you understood that people were bleeding at both ends of the process, in the newsroom and at the arena. You also, as an assistant sports editor at the Dallas Morning News from 1981 to 83, experienced a good old-fashioned newspaper war.
Yeah.
What was it like participating in a newspaper war?
It was very interesting. In 1981, I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I had gotten to know one of our writers, Dan Barrero, who is now up in Minneapolis and has become a talk radio legend, Minnesota Radio Hall of Famer. He went to the morning news to cover the NFL. And at that time, he was one of the first hires that Dave Smith, the sports editor, made.
Legendary Dave Smith.
At the Boston Globe had like the World Series with the Reds in 75, or was it 75? Or it was 75, the Reds World Series. He turned sports coverage on their head. He sent 10 writers to the games to cover all the angles, and it was revolutionary. And he got the morning news sports editor job, and the guy that was in overall charge of the morning news had been the executive editor at the AP. They hired him, and his goal was to beat the Times-Herald with coverage of sports and business. And Dave Smith got carte blanche, got all the space he wanted, all the money he wanted. Anybody could hire anybody, staff, do whatever he wanted.
Oh, yeah. He was like wasn't he a former Marine?
Yes. He was a tough guy to work for, just very demanding. I always said when I would lay out the paper and, go through all the stress of getting everything together, and it was a large section, and you were just, you were landing planes at LaGuardia and rush hour kind of stuff. And, he would mark up the next paper every day with a grease pencil. And I always thought that, with Dave, you get 99 out of 100 things done correctly, and he'd want to know about the 100th thing you screwed up, really. And he wouldn't talk about the 99 things. And it was amazing what the morning news turned into under Dave Smith. The Sunday sports section would be 24 to 30 pages. And
think about that. 30 pages of sports coverage.
Now today, and we live in Dallas and we subscribe to the morning news. There are many days when the regular sports section is 6 to 8 pages. Back then, if we had a less than a 20-page daily section, it was like, oh, we don't have enough space for all this stuff, because they covered everything. In the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, they sent 24 writers to cover the Olympics. It was, seriously.
I remember one time being in Dallas covering probably the NCAA tournament, and I picked up the Dallas Morning News, and I counted 14 different date lines in the sports section. And I'm not talking date lines from Texas.
No.
I'm talking around the globe. So this was the height of newspapers with revenue, with staff, resources, ambition. It was a real meat grinder of a fight, right?
Yeah, it was crazy. It was the height of newspapering.
Well, the height of the newspaper war and era was also the time that you eventually switched over into full-time writing. So you moved over to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in 1983 as an assistant sports editor.
Right.
In 1986, the Final Fours come into Dallas, and you're still a desk guy. Their new sports editor, Bruce Raven, comes to you and says, we want you to start writing about college basketball, national college basketball.
Right.
Why did you decide to make that switch then?
Well, he was the boss and he asked me. So it wasn't so much my choice. I had worked with Bruce at the Morning News. He had been an assistant sports editor there when I worked there. They brought in Rabin to say, look, we want to compete with the other two papers. And so they gave him more money and space, that kind of stuff. Actually, I asked Bruce about this years later, but I actually thought that Bruce didn't want me to be an assistant sports editor anymore. And so that's why he made me the college basketball writer.
Oh, you thought you were being demoted, huh?
Yeah, I loved college basketball. I'd really gotten into it. And he knew that. And I kind of said, well, okay, if that's what you want. But yeah, Bruce, and he was serious. He sent me everywhere almost. I was traveling like every other day, it seemed like, starting with basketball season.
Okay, so let's think about this. You go from going into the office every night.
Yep.
And in the fall of 85, you switched to become the national college basketball writer. What were the next 5 months like until the Final Four was held in Dallas in March of '86?
It was a complete blur. Here I was, all of a sudden I'm walking into Madison Square Garden, this little kid from Columbia, Missouri. Basically, it's like, and just going all over the place. I spent a week in Tobacco Road. He wanted me to do a big story because, North Carolina had won it in '82, then North Carolina State in '83, and here Krzyzewski's Duke team was one of the best in the country. The Dean Dome had his first game where it was Duke versus North Carolina. I was able to cover that game, and So I was and I didn't have any idea what I was doing as far as covering a beat. He say, okay, we want 2 notes columns a week. Okay, well, whatever. And I throw stuff together, and he planned out most of my schedule.
For 5 months, you were pretty much just traveling all over the country, right?
Yeah, it was amazing. I really had never traveled that much. I learned about American miles and Marriott points.
Oh, yes.
Which, eventually a couple years later, my wife and I kind of had our second honeymoon and went to Maui thanks to American and Marriott points. So there was a couple of perks. But Bruce was great at scheduling and looking ahead and saying, well, we probably need to go to this game. And when you make this trip, either talk to somebody there for a feature or figure out, he was great at getting the most bang for the buck as far as trips are concerned. But that season was just, I remember we got to the Final Four and even that was the first weekend I was in North Carolina. There were first and second round regionals in Greensboro and Charlotte, which are like 3 hours from each other. And they were Thursday, Saturday, Friday, Sunday. So Bruce's great idea was, well, just drive back and forth and cover them all.
Sure, why not?
So that's 8, 12, 14 games in 4 days, and it's like, okay, and I got done with that. He actually gave me a break. I didn't cover regional final. We had other writers that did go do stuff, but
right.
And then I get to the Final Four, and I was toast, and
you're on fumes. I think you said you had gone to like 27 cities, or
in the first month,
crazy.
Like at the end of November, and he even had me he helped me. I had one basketball trip where the Cowboys were playing at the Bengals in Cincinnati, and he said, "Well, that's Sunday. Why don't you go help us cover the Cowboys?" Sure, Bruce. Whatever.
You're like the special forces.
Yeah, exactly. And we, it wasn't related to basketball, but I covered a Patriots-Raiders playoff game in L.A. where that was just, that's what we were covering everything. And it's like, okay, this is a playoff game. We don't have anybody to cover it. Wendell, book a flight and go. And it was just, and the championship game was, quite something. Louisville Duke.
Right. Louisville won with freshman Purvis Ellison.
Yeah.
The star. Never nervous Purvis.
Yeah.
I think he had like 25 points, 11 rebounds.
Yeah.
And it was such a shocking thing, right, to see a freshman do that.
Yeah. That was back in the days when that wasn't, I think there was a guy back in 1944 for Utah that was the most outstanding player, and Purvis was the next one to do that. So it was just unheard of. And of course, for a long time, freshmen weren't eligible. But, when you're on deadline, the main thing is getting your lead. You want something that's going to grab somebody. And, I came up with, I'm not exactly a biblical scholar, but I came up with, and a child shall lead them.
Nice.
And the next day, I think it was somebody from I think Dave Anderson from the New York Times was there covering the Final Four as a columnist. And that was his lead. And I didn't plagiarize him because it's not like I wrote a second day story with that. But I remember I got a note from Bruce saying, yeah, it's pretty good lead. Look what Dave Anderson wrote.
Hey, you made it.
Yeah. So I was like, well, I was like, that's one, right?
I think you covered 343 NCAA tournament games. That's amazing. What was March like for you as a sports writer?
Again, it was hectic, but as the years went by, it was always kind of a challenge to, and you may get to this in a minute, but for the first 10 years of covering March Madness, that's basically what I did. And then 1994, they added National College Football to my list of beats because I had written about a lot of NCAA stuff in the offseason from college basketball and had gotten into all the the Prop 48 stuff and Title IX and all those issues. And they said, well, you're getting all this NCAA stuff. Why don't you just do college football too? And, oh, sure, why not? So
let's have Wendell do it. He'll do anything.
Yeah, exactly. Let Mikey try it. Mikey will lead anything. Google that commercial, kids. Anyway, so I would, that meant I'd start in July and end in early April. But for me, March Madness was a challenge because I got to the point where I wanted to figure out a way to get as much coverage as we could, as cheaply as we could, because one of the challenges of the NCAA tournament, particularly, the first weekend, you don't see the bracket until CBS lets you see it, Sunday evening at 5 or 6 o'clock.
Right.
And then you say, oh, look at this regional. Oh, well, this, maybe TCU has made a tournament. We got to send somebody there. And if it's a Thursday game, you pretty much have to travel Tuesday to get there for Wednesday's news conferences.
Right.
Which means Sunday night, you got to try to find flights. And it's usually during spring break. So if there's a tournament in Denver, first round, or in Florida, good luck finding a flight because they're all
Selection Sunday was one of the craziest days of the year for anybody covering that.
So I always tried to plan ahead and look at, and since Bruce had taught me well about, you can cover 2 sites in a weekend in the first round, I would try to look at places and say, well, there's a good chance this team might get sent here, so maybe we can, I can piggyback and do 2, which usually involved driving if it was in 3 to 4 hours of each other, and there were Thursday.
Yeah, it was just like being on a wagon train.
Exactly. I just drive back and forth, and you're
just filing.
Yep. And so and writing stories. So that was the challenge to me, was trying to plan it out. I mean, you knew where the Final Four was. You could book that. That was fine.
Yeah, you knew how you were going to get to Oz eventually. You just didn't know where the yellow brick road was going to take you.
And the early rounds, is just trying to, hopefully you got lucky and got somewhere where there's some good games.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, you certainly did get to some good games. When you think about those years, the first one that leaps to mind always for anybody who covered college basketball is the 92 East Regional Final, Duke versus Kentucky.
Yep.
Often called the greatest college basketball team ever. Christian Laettner with the last-second shot after the full-court pass from Grant Hill in overtime. Where were you sitting that night in Philadelphia?
I was probably second row, press row, beyond the baseline, and Laettner was down there. So if I'd have had my binoculars, I'd have been in great shape. But I was about as far away on press row from Laettner as you could be. And that was one of those games where it was over and, it's the greatest, craziest game you ever covered. And you sit there and, I was just like, how I don't know how to write this.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. Because, it was a game that had 2 game-winning shots. Kentucky scores with 2.1 seconds on a great drive to take the lead, and then Laettner kills them with his shot. So you had, in the space of just over 2 seconds, you had 2 game-winning shots.
Right.
And Kentucky was a great story because they had been shamed by the NCAA, and Pitino would come in, and you had all these guys that nobody wanted playing on this team.
And it was just a fantastic game from start to finish. It wasn't just the end, right? As the game was unfolding, did you grasp that this was not a normal day?
Yeah. I knew it was, I'm sitting there, this is the previous year. Actually, I'd seen Duke get run out of the gym by UNLV in 1990, then come back and upset them in the semifinals the next year, which, again, an unbelievably great game that nobody thought Duke had a chance to win. And here they are trying to become the first repeat since UCLA.
Right.
And I had written during the season, they're not going to do it. You got 6 games of 40 minutes. There's going to be a 5-minute stretch where you're not going to have it.
Right.
again, sometimes, when you're seeing a replay of the play 100 times, it's easy. But when you're sitting there watching it live, I mean, I didn't, I say, here's Grant Hill taking the pass out of bounds. He's Calvin Hill's son. Okay, he's a great sophomore. It's like, well, okay, well, I didn't look at whether or not guarding inbounder, which a lot of people criticize Pitino for. And it's like, I guess they're going to try to get the ball to Leitner. But again, it's just like, I think honestly at the time, I was just like, I was kind of blanking out. Not really. I was just kind of watching what's going to happen. I didn't analyze it. And it's like, oh my God, he hit the shot. I mean, it was so, one of those things where something happens in a blink of an eye and you blinked and you kind of like, I don't know what happened.
What was it like in the arena at that moment?
Oh, it was bedlam. It was, people were going crazy. And another thing that I didn't realize later, there's this great shot that from CBS right after Leitner's shot, which I think embellishes and shows what March Madness is about. Thomas Hill, one of Duke's starters, was not on the floor for the shot. And there's a picture of him on the sideline, and he's like this. And
holding his head in disbelief.
But it's like they lost. I mean, it's almost like he's in tears from that one quick half-second shot of him. He can't believe they made the shot, but it's almost like if you just saw that, you'd say, well, that guy's team lost.
Where did you go for the post-game?
I went to the press conferences. I went to the Duke locker room, and tried to get what I could. And I was, again, I mean, I'm being totally honest. I mean, I'd been doing it for a while, covering college basketball. I honestly didn't know what to do. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to. I remember sitting in the press room, looking at my laptop, and I asked the desk, I said, can I do a little sidebar in addition to my game story? Because I wanted to cover as much as I could. And I was just sitting there thinking, I don't know where to start. I don't know what I'm going to. And the funny thing was, I've gone back and read my story. It wasn't that bad. But, Pat Forty was there. Rick Bozich was there because they were covering Kentucky, guys that I'd gotten to know. And all these great writers at Hoops Weiss was there. And I was kind of looking around. I said, I wonder what the heck they're going to write. And I'm not being humble or modest. I was really like, man, I'm like, okay, I'll try. But it was like,
how do I make sense of this, right?
I felt the pressure of trying to have a story as good as the game, which, whatever.
Well, as a native of Kentucky, I can attest that it was one of the most crushing losses for that state.
Absolutely.
And the very next day, you go from sitting courtside for that loss in Philly to you are in Lexington, Kentucky the next day to cover the Fab Five versus Ohio State in a regional final.
Yes.
What was it like in Lexington the very next day when you got to town?
I didn't. I flew from. That's one of my trips that I had planned to say, okay, I can fly from Philly to Cincinnati fairly cheaply and then drive to Lexington.
Right.
But I was up late. I remember getting in a cab with the Syracuse athletic director who was on the committee the morning after the game. We were both going to the airport from the same hotel. It was like I was up at like 5 a.m. I probably got 3 hours sleep. I got to Cincinnati, checked into my hotel room. I took a nap. I was just trying, again, I was like out of gas trying to get there. I don't remember what the feeling was as far as Lexington, and I had to do a Final Four preview for the paper for Monday in addition to covering.
You were just trying to survive in advance.
Yeah. And Michigan, Ohio State was a hell of a game. Here's two teams from the same conference. It was the Fab Five as freshmen. It was. Yeah,
that was a great game too.
So, I'm sitting there and it's like, oh, well, hey, another game. But it's like yesterday's game was a little better. But I think it went overtime too. So I think 2 straight overtime games to go to the Final Four. Those are the things that when you get through covering March Madness, you look back on and say, Yeah, I think sometimes in perspective, when you're years removed from it, you have a different take because in the moment, obviously, you're just trying to write. Yeah.
You're trying to make sense of it and beat your deadline and that's all you're really kind of focusing on. I know myself, when I look back on it, I have a little different thoughts about if I've witnessed a moment like that. You were there in 1987 when Keith Smart hits his final shot to win the national title for Indiana. And this is only a couple years into your tenure as a national college writer.
Yep.
What was it like on a Monday night at the end of a championship game trying to write that story?
Again, yeah, and I did have a good view of that. It was down at my end of the floor. I was like in the second row of press row, so I was kind of elevated. And the interesting thing, the very first Final Four I ever went to when I was working in Dallas, the new Final Four in '82 was in New Orleans, and I asked golf for the weekend. I had a friend in New Orleans. I got tickets. That was Michael Jordan against Georgetown.
So you saw that?
I saw that game.
Yeah, but you didn't have to write that one. This time you got to write.
No, I got, yeah. It's like, hey, I'm just a fan. But, Jordan's shot was about 10 feet away from Smart's. And obviously it was Knight's, turned out to be his last national championship. Maybe I'll set you up for some Knight questions. But I remember going to that Final Four and knowing Knight's reputation with writers. And in the group press conferences, where we're all sitting there in the audience and raising our hand to ask a question, I made damn sure that my questions for Bob Knight were practically written down, because I was not going to have him chop me into little pieces about what a stupid question that was.
Right.
And it was, I felt like I was in a professor's class for that. But yeah, that was, again, it was one of those things where, it's like, oh, okay, championship game, final shot. Hoosiers had come out.
Right. It was all there. The whole story was fabulous, right?
Yeah, and so, there were plenty of, as a writer, you want as many options to go with, and then that game provided quite a few, and I don't remember if my story was worth a damn, but it made deadline.
So you wrote down this question for Knight, and you rehearsed it, and you asked it. What kind of response did you get?
It was actually pretty good. I want to say that I remember him at least saying, "Oh, that's a good question," or whatever. But I was prepared. And as you well know, and I know this is kind of your motto, it's like failing to prepare is preparing to fail.
John
Wooden, and I didn't pick that up early in my career, but I picked it up as I went along and saying, you know what? You need to be ready for anything. And
plus, the week before, you were in Cincinnati for the regional.
When
Indiana was playing LSU, and Bob Knight and Dale Brown, LSU coach, were big enemies. And there was a moment there where you're sitting press row, and what did you see? I
saw Knight, after a call, slam the phone. They had a phone at press row, believe it or not, an actual phone like this phone. I guess for the officials to call wherever or whatever. It was a red phone. I don't know. Maybe it had something to do with the president. But anyway, the Knight was upset with a call, and he was sitting. It was right in front of the the members of the basketball committee get to sit at the official scores table, and I think the phone was right in front of one of those members of the committee. And Knight picked the handset of the phone up and slammed it down on the receiver, and the phone jumped up off the table, and he didn't get a technical. And, LSU, which was a very underseeded, underrated team, and Indiana was one of the teams that I think they were probably a 1 seed, but they were favored to probably win the national championship. They barely beat LSU. And, at that time, Dale Brent had the reputation. The previous year, he'd gone to the Final Four, I think, with an 11 seed.
Right.
And so, he had this reputation of messing teams up that were better than his team. And he was a very adamant enemy of Knight as far as his bullying techniques.
Yeah, he used to just call Knight a bully, which was unheard of for another coach to say that type of thing.
And in all honesty, as it's turned out over the years, Dale Brown was right about that, I think. But so that that had kind of set the tone for the Final Four of Knight previously had thrown the chair across the floor and had, he had a number of either on-court or off-court temper tantrums where he had become, terrible Bobby Knight. So, that incident at the regional final was a good precursor to that Final Four in New Orleans.
Well, 87 was kind of the height of his power. Exactly. He won. That was his third national championship.
Yep.
He won. He took the U.S. to the gold medal in 84.
Yep.
He was the guy. This is only a couple years into the three-point shot, which he never really adapted to. So he was rolling the game at that time. And so he was just always in the news and always copied for writers.
Yep. And, his last Final Four, was in 92.
Yep, I was there.
When Duke repeated. Duke beats Indiana in the semifinals. Close game. And, you know, it was famous for after that game. I mean, here's Krzyzewski. He's already won a national championship, former Knight assistant.
Played for Knight at Army.
You know, he was a Coach Knight guy. And in the handshake line, Knight gave him the drive-by. The handshake, it wasn't like stop and put your hand on the guy's shoulder saying, nice job, good luck in the championship game. It was just like handshake, keep going. He goes down to the end of the bench, and he wasn't an assistant coach, but Knight knew him, and he spent more time chatting with that guy at the end of the bench than he had with Krzyzewski's former assistant.
Right.
And it was just a virtual slap in the face to Krzyzewski. To me, it was like, my pupil is now the teacher, and I don't like it. Grudge was one of the things Knight did more than a lot of people. He did some nice things for some people, but he had a long list of grudges, and you just happened to end up on the list.
Wendell, how did you take a guy like Knight when you were writing about college basketball and not let personal feelings impact what you were writing? What was the challenge of that?
As it went on, I mean, in 87, not so much in 92. I mean, I didn't, if I'd have had an opportunity to write a column after the Duke-Indiana game in 92, I would have probably, torched him. I remember when he got fired, I wrote a column for the paper, and, by that time I had gotten to the point of realizing that this is a guy he was basically a hypocrite, because what he demanded of his players, he couldn't do himself, which was control his temper. He wanted his players to play perfect game, and he got on them. He was even angry at his son when he played for him if he made a mistake. I mean, he was a guy that, instead of being able to control his emotions like he expected his players to, he couldn't do it. And to me, that was the reason why. And I wrote that. I said, here's the irony of Bob Knight, who at the, one of the greatest coaches ever, was that he didn't practice what he preached.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was personal, but that at the time was like, I guess maybe I had more of an epiphany, thinking, okay, this is what this guy is, and you have to understand it, and this is why he doesn't coach at Indiana.
I always thought Knight was just kind of representative of a certain era of a coaching style.
Exactly.
He played basketball at Ohio State in the early 60s when Woody Hayes was the football coach. Bob was from Ohio. He understood the whole Woody Hayes thing. And I just think in those days, coaches could get away with that type of thing. Not to excuse it. No. It was just different. Yeah. And it was just fascinating to see how that type of coach, not just Knight, but other guys of that ilk, could behave and be excused. And that's looking back in a perspective now, years later, when things have changed. But it never ceased to be a fascinating topic for writers when they were there in the moment.
Yeah, and, the thing is that, I mean, the world we live in now with Twitter and social media and whether or not it's a viral video or not. I mean, Woody Hayes punching the Clemson player went viral, but it was only on TV. Right. Now, you can imagine the commotion it would have created in this modern day if it had been all over Twitter. I mean, he did lose his job over that. Right. And again, the video doesn't lie. I mean, Knight choking Neil Reed in practice was, again, one of the nails in the coffin for him that showed his Woody Hayes type behavior toward one of his players, not to an opposing player, but one of his players. In the time when he looked like he kicked his son on the bench, those kind of things. And, then he would make fun of it by bringing a whip to the regional final or the Final Four.
There's such a long list of things that, that counterbalance the 900 wins and national championships and everything else. And again, Knight wasn't alone. There was a lot of coaches like that. Jackie Sherrill had a bull castrated to try to, in front of his team to try to motivate them, right? So, hey, you had to be tough. Yeah. It was different.
Can I tell a story about the bull castration? It's an editing story.
Hey, we will take all stories about bull castration by Jackie Sherrill. Go for it.
you had mentioned I was at the 92 regional final in Lexington, and I was doing a Final Four preview also because that was the last game of the regional Elite Eights. And, I was kind of doing a little bullet notes thing. And Mississippi State, or maybe this probably wasn't the right way. Anyway, Mississippi State had got to the Final Four. And so it wasn't in 92. I'm getting my dates mixed up because I'm old. But anyway, Mississippi State had won and got to the Final Four, and Sherrill was the coach. And not too long before that, he had done the thing where he had castrated the bull because they were getting ready to play Texas, the Longhorns, and he wanted to motivate his team.
Right. So
they were going to be playing Syracuse in the regional or in the Final Four semifinals.
This is still one of my favorites.
And so, I was, you tried to be a little, smart alecky or snarky. So my little paragraph thing was, hey, so Texas A&M gets to play Syracuse in their in Saturday's semifinal. No word that whether Jackie Sherrill is going to show up and castrate an orange.
I see what you did there. But did the desk see what you did there?
No. And, this was after, I think it was, it was the Sunday before the Final Four. I'd been covering, 2 weekends of the tournament. I was worn out. I was finishing the Lexington. I was one of the last people in the press room. And so I'm getting ready, I'm packing stuff up. And back in those days before cell phones, you had a rule. Like before you were saying, okay, I'm done, you would call the office and say, has anybody got any questions for me? Did I screw up something or did, whatever. So I called the desk, say, hey, everything okay? And he said, oh, yeah, the guy that, so-and-so wants to talk to you. So I get him on the phone and he said, Wendell, you can't castrate an orange. And I'm like, okay. It's like, oh my God. It's like, it was like, it's a good thing no one anybody in the pressure. I wasn't yelling at him, but I got very animated saying, do you understand like irony or humor or anything?
You turned into Bob Knight.
Oh, no, I wasn't. I sit here and people that know me will be surprised. I didn't cuss. I didn't yell. You
just tried to explain that this is a play on words. The Syracuse orange and you're...
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like, yes, I know you can't castrate an orange, but do you understand? And maybe he was thinking, well, people don't understand about the Jackie Sherrill reference. But if you have to explain about him castrating the bull...
In Texas...
Well, that, and it's like, you can't, that ruins the joke. It's like, you can't, so it stayed in, they actually went with it, but it was like a 5-minute conversation of my frustration and, being worn out, tired, trying to say, at some points I would have just said, okay, fine, just take it out,
right.
But
All right, well, you mentioned football, I mentioned football, and you started covering national college football in 1994, which happened to be the same year you were president of the Basketball Writers Association of America. So you had a lot on your plate. You started covering college football the way you did basketball by traveling around to the big games. And just like in basketball, you got to see some amazing moments. I think you were at the Nebraska-Missouri Flea Flicker. You were at the USC Notre Dame Bush Push. Ohio State Miami for the national title. You were also there for the Boise State Oklahoma Fiesta Bowl. I was not there, but this involves a trash can, I do believe.
Yeah.
Please explain.
I had gone in because Oklahoma it's not one of our schools, basically, but Oklahoma was in the same conference, the Big 12. So it was like, that was a school that the Star-Telegram paid attention to. We'd cover some of their home games based on whether it was important, that kind of thing. Told the editors that I'm going to go out, cover the Fiesta Bowl. So I flew out that day. Nobody expected Boise State to hang with Oklahoma. It was Adrian Peterson's probably last game. He was a junior.
Right, yes.
That was part of the reason to be there. And I was going to write a column about Adrian Peterson's career in addition to writing a game story. Because, as I said earlier, if I went to the game and the paper was paying the money and I could possibly do it and they had the space, I said, look, I'm going to give you as much as I can on deadline. And so I could get a column done. I kind of sort of write it ahead of time and then kind of massage it and update it. And I'll do a game story. And you'll be so happy that I did all this. So, they get, Oklahoma's behind. They get an interception touchdown return, they go ahead and and those, as you well know, Todd, most of the time with a college football game, particularly on deadline or at any time, with 5 minutes to go, they'd say, riders, you could elevator to go down to the field, so you would be on the field for the last couple of minutes.
Right.
Which was a blessing and a curse because sometimes something would happen. Now, if it was a 2-touchdown game, you didn't worry about it. You knew the game, but
this particular game, something happened.
Yeah, oh yeah, it did. I mean, first of all, Boise State's ahead in the elevator going down. They had the radio on. Oklahoma gets an interception return for a touchdown, goes ahead with like a minute 10 to go. Okay, Oklahoma's going to win. Okay, and I wanted to try to get Peterson on the field for a quick quote. So I had my laptop with me. So I get down there, and then all of a sudden, Boise State does every play in their playbook and scores the touchdown. It goes overtime, But anyway, I had to update my story. I had my laptop. I'm on the sideline, and, you have to have a flat surface for your laptop. You can't, I wouldn't have done the story on a phone, but I didn't have enough. So I find one of those flat top trash cans, and I sit my laptop down on it to try to work on updating my story. Bill Hancock, who is now in charge of the
working conditions. I love it.
Exactly. Yeah, he remembers seeing me. He said, "Oh, Bill
Hancock's in charge of the world now, I believe."
Yeah, exactly. And he says, "I always remember seeing you. Working on your story on that trash can." And it's like some people say, "Well, that's very appropriate that your story was done on a trash can." But anyway, and then Boise State does.
So while Boise State is doing all these trick plays, you're typing on top of a trash can.
Yeah. And then I get down to the end of the I got down to the end of the field where they do overtime. Peterson runs in a touchdown on the first play, and you think Oklahoma's going to win. Then Boise State ties it with another trick play, and then they go for 2 with the Statue of Liberty and then win it. And the guy that scores the touchdown proposes to his cheerleader girlfriend. And it's like, how much other things could happen in this game? So anyway, luckily the photography room, which is just off the tunnel going into the locker rooms, had Wi-Fi, so I could go in there and finish all my stuff up and send both my stories in.
Did you take the trash can with you?
No. I found a table in the photography room to work on. I only used the trash can once.
Have trash can, will travel.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And one of the things that I always envy the guys at this point, internet was a big thing. The great thing that an internet guy has over the newspaper deadline, you didn't really have a deadline. I mean, you didn't want to get your story done, but because I go in the Boise State locker room, I was going to do a fall story, and it's like, I wish I could have had some of this stuff for my story, because I think Brian Harsin was the offensive coordinator at that time for Boise State, and we were talking to him, and he said that Statue of Liberty, that was the last play we had. We didn't have anything left.
We had nothing left in the arsenal.
We had used every, trick play, every special kind of play. That was the last thing we had. And it's like, okay, my story's already gone. And it's I would have loved to have had that, but whatever. That's life.
Well, I just love the fact that you found a trash can and you improvised and were able to use it as a table to write. As someone who wrote many things that many people reminded me should have been thrown in a trash can.
Yep.
Thinking of you typing on that trash can just brings a lot of joy to my life, Wendell.
That's the perfect story for my career.
Well, I think it does show the fact that you could adapt. You could find a way to get things done. And also, you were always looking out for the other writers, the good of the other writers. You did it as president of the basketball writers that year, but you also did it in 1998 at a football game. Number 2 Kansas State beats the defending champ Nebraska. Kansas State coach Bill Snyder, at this great moment, probably the best win in Kansas State history, he decides he's not going to let the media talk to his quarterback, Michael Bishop, a Heisman Trophy candidate, right?
Yes. It was a huge story for, I covered national college football, but the Big 12 was a big part of that.
Right.
And this was, Kansas State had been awful, and Snyder had come in there and in a few years had turned it around. Here's Nebraska, the big bully of the Big 12, coming to Manhattan. Kansas State, I think, was maybe number 1 then or number 2. Whatever. And it was a big weekend for Kansas State in Manhattan, and they played a great game. Michael Bishop played a great game. They upset Nebraska. place is going nuts. It's, whatever. They tear down the goalpost. And after the game, it's like, well, it'd be nice to talk to Michael Bishop. But he had been off limits all season. Snyder wasn't letting him talk to the media, which, okay, but it's like, this game? Come on, can we talk to him? Well, it turned out that Tim Layden of Sports Illustrated was
great
able
reporter
to talk.
And writer at Sports Illustrated.
Great guy, but it's Sports Illustrated, which back then, folks, that was big. It's SI.com
right.
now. It's a website. It's, Sports Illustrated is no longer Sports Illustrated, but whatever. So Layden gets a chance to talk because Bishop was a Heisman Trophy candidate. He was one of the finalists that went to New York. He didn't win it. But so I find out Layden got to talk to him. I don't know, somebody, maybe Dennis Dodd or some other writer friend of mine said, Layden got to talk to Bishop. And I was like, one thing my wife will tell me that I am a Don Quixote as far as going after windmills, and I get angry about little things and say, well, I'm going to stand for this.
You're all about fairness here, Wendell.
Well, I was just like, this isn't right. If you don't want to talk to the media, fine. But this is you're playing favorites. So I type up a letter and I faxed it because it was 1998.
Oh, I love it. The fax machine.
Well, it was an email. So I fax him, fax a letter to the football office. Dear Bill Snyder, I don't think it's fair or correct that you allowed Bishop to talk to Sports Illustrated when the other writers couldn't talk to him. I just don't think, whatever. About 30 minutes later, the phone in my home office rings. Pick it up. I have Coach Snyder on the line for you. Thinking, oh, boy. Here we go. I'm going to get yelled at. And he came on and said, Wendell, I got your letter. You were right. I'm sorry. That was wrong. I shouldn't have done that.
Really?
Yeah. He apologized and said, I'm going to make sure Michael talks to the media the rest of the season. And it's funny, ever since then, we didn't have a lot of interactions, but, and Snyder had this reputation of being a guy who was, he controlled the type of butter that his team would have for a pregame meal. They had one pat of butter. Seriously. He controlled everything.
I wish I had him in charge of my diet.
Well, yeah. But, he was, and that's one of the reasons K-State got to be where K-State was, because he was saying, this is how we're going to do it. But he was, and I don't like to get into the idea of being friends with coaches or whatever, because you really aren't friends.
Right.
But ever since then, he was so nice and cordial with me, honestly, not because, hey, I want you to write a story about so-and-so. But, he'd say, hey, Wendell, how you doing? Everything. We'd have a brief but nice conversation.
Right.
And I respected him for the fact that, rather than being what most coaches would have done and either ignored what I said or call me up and say, how dare you tell me how to run my program? He admitted that he had made a mistake in this case and was going to correct it. And, that was like, okay, once again, that's two. So that's as much a Bill Snyder story as it is one of my stories.
Well, I think that's really interesting that somebody would acknowledge that they were wrong.
Yeah.
When it's not typical for a coach to acknowledge that they're wrong to the media.
And I didn't write a story about it.
Right.
I didn't say, oh, well, here's what happened with me and Bill Snyder, which, again, in this day and age, I think a lot of people might have blogged about it or whatever, but I didn't consider that a story to write. And I didn't particularly consider it a victory or whatever.
Well, I think it shows you the kind of working relationship you could have because of the access that you had in those days, right?
Yes, that is true, that I was able to get through to Snyder. These days, I guess you could still send a fax to a coach, but, I still think even if you send an email, it's going to probably go through an SID.
Right.
And unless you're congratulating him on a victory or his retirement or career, that coach is never going to see that if it's critical.
Well, it also shows, too, Wendell, so much about what you were about as a well-respected reporter. Just thoroughness, looking out for what you thought was right or wrong, looking out for other writers. And you did that for so many years, so productive, cranked them out for many, many years. And you were always there. I knew if I was at a game and it was a big game, that Wendell Barnhouse was going to be there. And it was always good to chat with you and see you.
Same here.
And I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. We've had some different types of stories. I don't know if we've ever talked about castrating an orange
well,
on this show, but That's already one of my favorites.
I like to break new territory, new ground. It's like I don't know how many podcasts out there in the world do discuss a orange castration. I don't know if that would be in the fruit category or the medical category. Maybe both. I don't know.
Well, I think we all need some medical attention at this point. So, I appreciate this. Wendell, it's been a real treasure to spend time again and reconnect. And thank you so much for sharing the stories that you have shared with us today, and wish you all the best.
Todd, I appreciate it. Same to you. And these podcasts you're doing, I've seen the list of people you had. This is a tremendous collection of oral histories, basically, as far as sports writing is concerned. So kudos to you for doing this. And I hope that it gets preserved in a number of places for anybody that wants to learn about how the business used to be.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.